We just welcome the online folks as he's coming. We're glad you're joining us. We would love to see you here.
So, are any of you afraid of anything? Do any of you have any irrational fears? Most of us are afraid of something, maybe only one thing, maybe more than that, but many of us also have these irrational fears. And when I'm talking about irrational fears, I'm talking about things that you're afraid of that you think maybe you shouldn't be afraid of, but you are. These kinds of fears do really strange things to us that there's really no way to understand or to process. They just sort of happen to us. Fear of heights is mine. I don't think I've always been afraid of heights, but at some juncture I became afraid of heights. And to tell you the truth, I don't actually mind being in high places. I actually love it. That's why we go to the mountains so much and hike up into those mountains so much, is that we really love that. But you would not believe how hard I have to work to make myself walk to the edge of anything and look down. I got stuck on my roof 2 winters ago because I was up there shoveling and I slipped. And I thought I was going to get a free ride to the concrete down below, and I didn't. But then I couldn't make my body go over the side to the rung of the ladder to get back down. And it was about 10 minutes before I got myself to the place where I could do that. Usually I stay way back from the edge of something. And if I do go to the edge, I don't stay there very long at all. About 5 years ago, I went to a Wild at Heart men's retreat way up by Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. And a part of that weekend included elements where you could push yourself a little bit physically and whatnot. And I was beyond 50 years old, and I was thinking about, man, I still need to push myself a little bit, or I'll sit down in a chair sometime and just sit there the rest of my life. And so one of the things that they had at this retreat center was a great big climbing wall. And they had all the professional gear and all of that stuff. And I'm like, I'm afraid of heights, and maybe I should try that and just push myself. And so I got all geared up, got all the instructions, helmet on, all of that gear, got on the rope system, learned what to say to the person that was doing the belay and whatever. And then I started climbing up this wall, and everything was going good. I was making good progress, and up there 100 feet or so was a bell. And if you got to the top, you'd ring the bell, and I'd been watching people go up and ring the bell. And so I'm going up this thing, and I get to a certain point. I'm like 3/4 of the way up, and I just get tired. And so I think that I'm going to stop and rest for a moment. And so I did, and I made the mistake of looking around. And when I looked to my left, I realized that this thing was built on a bluff. And I could see almost the bottom, way below where I started. And my climb was over. It was done. I mean, there was a second there where I'm like, I have to ring that bell. And then my brain said, you are an idiot. Get off of this thing. Now, to tell you the truth, the best part of the whole experience was rappelling back down. That was just a riot. Going down was all kinds of fun. It's funny, but fear does that kind of thing to us. It messes with us in ways that we don't fully comprehend, or that we don't want it to do, but it's still there, and it still works on us in all kinds of strange ways. We're still in a sermon series here this fall titled Soul Detox. We're thinking about the idea of things that we need to detox our souls from. If you were to look up a definition of detox, you would find this: a regimen to treat or treatment intended to remove toxins, impurities, or addictive substances from the body. And so in this series, we are exploring things that we believe we need to remove from our souls and from our lives in order to pursue God and to pursue life as God wants us to do. So I've said this every week. I'll say it again. This is not an original title to me, and all of the ideas that I'm going to share with you are not exclusively mine. Craig Groeschel, a pastor in Oklahoma, wrote a book titled Soul Detox, and I read it several years ago and had always wanted to share it here, and so I'm using that as a template and as a guide for it. His book is subtitled Clean Living in a Contaminated World, and that's what we're reaching for when we're doing Soul Detox. So today we're going to talk about the need to detox our souls from fear and what fear does to us. The chapter in Craig's book about this is subtitled Unlocking the Chokehold of Fear. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. Now, you may already be thinking of a Bible verse that you think tells us everything that we need to know about fear as a child of God. There's actually a favorite verse that gets referenced a whole lot. Sadly, with all of the truth that's in it, it gets misused a lot, but it's still there. And so let's start there today. In 2 Timothy 1:7, you read the following words: "For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity." Say that fast 3 times. But instead of that spirit, He has given us a spirit of power and love and self-discipline. It's a really bizarre thing, but probably in the last 5 years or so, I have heard this verse used as an attack against all kinds of people, including myself. And I'll promise you that's a severe misuse of what is going on in this particular text. So what does this text actually tell us? And specifically, what does it actually tell us about fear? What do we need to understand about fear and what God wants to do related to fear or the not having fear in our lives? Well, like most biblical texts, in order to actually have any idea what is going on in a single verse, you need to know something about why was the book written, who was it written to, what's the context around it, and all of those kinds of things. If you have a good study Bible, you can find all that information, or if you go online, you can find all of it in a few clicks. It's just sometimes we don't take that step to go look and see what's there. So think for a moment about what's actually there around this verse. One of the things that we know is that this entire letter is written to a young person named Timothy, who is also chosen by God to be a leader in the church in the area that he was. It's the famous apostle, the famous missionary Paul, that writes this letter to him, talking to him about all kinds of things that he needs to know as a young leader in the church about life and faith and operating in the church. Now, what we don't really know is what is the exact situation that's going on in Timothy's life that calls Paul, guided by the Holy Spirit, to write to him and say, we shouldn't have a spirit of fear and timidity. We don't know all of those details. We simply don't get a look into what's going on for Timothy in this. But what we do know is that the context tells us that this statement is actually directly related to how Timothy views his calling by God. How he's looking at the calling that God has put on his life to be a leader, despite the fact that he's young, to be a leader in the church where he's at. In verse 6, when Paul is talking to him about this larger idea, Paul says, he reminds Timothy to fan the flames of the spiritual gift that God put in his life when Paul laid hands on him and God imparted this spiritual gift to him. So that in this case, it seems as if what's actually being referenced in 2 Timothy 1:7 is that his fear, the fear that Timothy has to do with exercising and using and living in his spiritual calling and his spiritual gifting. Like it's not some random, irrational fear, or it's not really a large, sweeping statement about fear. So much it is Paul saying to Timothy, God has given you a gift, and God has called you into something, and that calling is not a calling that should bring great fear in your life, but rather that calling is something that you should experience and live in and do out of the power of God and the love of God and the self-discipline that comes from God. Now, there's an important thing that is a big overarching idea in this verse that is important for us to grasp and to think about as we are pondering fear and maybe the fears that we have, whether they're real fears or irrational fears. And that big teaching is this, that this kind of fear does not come from God. The kind of fear that will prevent you from exercising your spiritual giftedness, the kind of fear that will prevent you from living into the calling that God has put on your life, whatever that looks like, that fear that keeps that stuff from happening in a good and God-honoring way is not a fear that comes from God. God is not the one that puts that kind of fear in us. Why? Well, simply because that's not what God does. Nor is that what he had given to Timothy. Instead, he's called Timothy and given Timothy his power and his love and his self-discipline. Have you ever had an occasion where you talked to somebody about what you were afraid of? You ever done that? That takes a little bit of courage, actually. Sometimes what we're afraid of are some of our deepest, darkest secrets, and we sometimes don't really want that out there or want to talk to someone else about it. If you've talked with someone about it, have you ever had someone suggest to you, well, you just shouldn't be afraid? Question, does that help? Does somebody telling you you shouldn't be afraid make you not afraid? Now, what I didn't tell you about my roof story was that my brother-in-law Todd, who was an XL lineman and climbs things like he's part squirrel, was up there with me. And part of what was so hard about it was he scrambles up and down stuff like that like it's nothing. And I'm standing there on the edge of my own roof, frozen, unable to work up the courage to try to get down, right? And so it added angst to the whole situation because somebody was right there by me who wasn't afraid at all. You know what's really kind of cool, though? He didn't make fun of me. He didn't tell me just to not be afraid. He even said, well, we shoveled some snow down there. Maybe you'll land in that, which didn't actually help very much. But I mean, it was true. He just encouraged me. He's like, I think the ladder is solid and stable. And if you can just get in this right spot and swing your leg over there, I think you've got good traction where you're at. And he was just being helpful. He wasn't messing with me. But listen, it would not have moved me 1 inch closer to getting down if he had said, just don't be afraid. Right? Most things in life are not quite that simple, and we sometimes can't just decide in our heads to fix the fact that we're afraid. So somebody looking at you or just saying to you out of context, well, the Bible says that you shouldn't be afraid because God hasn't given you a spirit of fear, probably is not going to help you greatly. It's probably just not going to work that way because, well, one, that's out of its context, and two, we just don't snap our fingers and stop being afraid of things that we're afraid of. Craig Rochelle writes in the book that human fear generally fits into one or more of 4 categories. He calls them the not-so-fantastic 4. Look at this list. Do a little self-evaluation if you look at this list. Fear of loss, whatever that might look like, whatever shape that might take. Fear of failure, not being able to get something done. Fear of rejection, fear of somebody not accepting us, or worse yet, declaring that we're not worth anything and pushing us off. And probably the big one on this list is number 4, the fear of the unknown. What do you actually know? And how much of your life is actually unknown? At least to you. A lot of it. Now, very often our fears fit into one of these, or one or more of them, and every one of them can be really, really difficult to navigate. And one of the common denominators in all of these things is that they live and thrive in the soil of what if. What if? What if? Now, I want to say this not as an excuse, but as a reminder that when we are experiencing fear, even fear related to these things, we're actually in pretty good company. There are some pretty good and some pretty great people who have struggled with fears in some of these areas, and some of them are some of the heroes that we look up to in the biblical text. And there are occasions in the biblical text where the story about their fears gets written. And we get to look at it and see it and see how it works on them and see what maybe happens to it. You might know the name Moses. You know Moses? Have you ever heard of Moses before? You might know already that Moses is the guy who broke the Jews free from the chokehold of enslavement by the Egyptians. You might know that Moses is the guy who quite literally talked with God. You might know that Moses is the guy who literally received the very law of God for the Jewish people. You might remember that Moses is the guy that led them through the wilderness all those years and all those miles until they stood on the edge of the promised land that God had for them. However, you may not know about, or you might not remember, the following story about Moses. In Exodus chapter 4, verse 1, you read these words. But Moses protested again. Let me pause there and tell you that in this context, Moses and God are having a conversation. God's talking to Moses about what he wants Moses to do and what Moses is being called and equipped by him to do. And Moses is responding to that. And so we read the words, but Moses protested again. What if they don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never actually appeared to you? Now, what's remarkable about this is that this what if is just one of a whole series of what if questions or what if statements that Moses makes. You can go back into Exodus chapter 3 and read the whole story, and God says to Moses, I have heard the cries of my people in Egypt, and now I am going to set them free, and you are going to be the instrument to lead that process. You are going to lead the human side of the freeing of the Jewish people from Egyptian slavery. And if you read the story, an angel of God appears to Moses in a bush that's on fire but doesn't burn up, and he has this whole conversation with God in that context. And throughout chapter 3 of Exodus, God tells Moses what he is supposed to do and how he is supposed to do it. And Moses repeatedly says, but what about this? What about this? What about this? What if this? What if this? What if this? And so this verse in chapter 4, verse 1, is another of these. And I want you to notice the nature of what Moses is wrestling with and with what Moses is saying and doing. And it's all wrapped up in his fear of doing what God is telling him to do and what God is saying, I have equipped you to do, and I am going to go with you in doing. It's all about what ifs. Moses says, what if? What about? But. Over and over again throughout chapters 3 and 4. And what is seen so clearly about Moses in chapter 3 and 4 is that the what ifs are paralyzing to Moses. What ifs tend to do that to us. Craig Rochelle writes the following. People often say that fear is the opposite of faith, but I respectfully disagree. The way I see it, fear actually relies on faith. It's simply faith in the wrong things. Fear is placing your faith in what ifs rather than in God is. It's allowing your imagination to wander down a long, dark alley of possibilities and get mugged every couple of steps. Almost everyone who allows themselves to be taken hostage by what ifs discovers that the only thing binding them is their own imaginations. So let me say this. Before we start thinking poorly of Moses, and before we start looking down on him, I want to ask the question, do we ever play the same game? Do we ever play the what-if game ourselves? Do we ever play the what-if game with what maybe we sense God is telling us, or God is talking to us about, or God is asking us to do? And my guess is that if we're honest, most of us on some level or another get stuck in the paralyzing trap of the what-if game. Craig Rochelle says, your what-ifs actually do matter. In fact, if you stop and analyze them, you can usually gain some vital insight. One of the first being is that what you fear reveals often what you value the most. What you fear often reveals what you value the most. Examining what you fear can illuminate your priorities, which are always a good thing to know. He goes on to write, when you have persistent fear in a given area of your life, it can be an indicator that you're not depending on God to handle it. In other words, what you fear reveals where you trust God the least. Now, you're probably all aware of this already. But fear works to create angst in us about all sorts of things. And Jesus was highly aware of this, and he talked very often about this idea, this awareness, this notion that we get tangled up in fears, and fears do destructive things to us. One of the more well-known occasions we find in Matthew chapter 6, verse 27, where Jesus tells a series of parables to teach the following statement or to ask the following question: can all your worries add a single moment to your life? And I'm going to suggest to us that the answer is obviously no. And I'm also going to suggest that very often the what-ifs that we are tangled up with that cause so much fear in our life, worrying about them like we do, generally doesn't help us one bit either. Can all our what-ifs, all of our things, all the things that we worry about at any time to our lives, can they actually help us, or do they cause us harm? So I want to transition at this point and ask the question then, so what do we do if we find ourselves caught in the chokehold of fear and in the chokehold of what-ifs? Well, the good news is the biblical texts do not just point out to us the fact that fear is not from God, but rather it also directs us toward things that are helpful as well. Instead of saying, don't be afraid, or saying in an accusing way, you're afraid, the Bible offers to us some genuine help. One place that offers some great help about this, and I believe we've looked at this verse before in this series. It is one of those great common denominator verses about these kind of things, is in James 1:5. And James writes in James 1:5, if you need wisdom, insert the idea about anything here. If you need any kind of wisdom about anything, ask our generous God and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. Two big statements here. One is that if you need wisdom about fears, ask God for help with it. Ask God about it. Talk to God about those things. And the second thing is this, and it's remarkable, that if we do that, he won't rebuke or reject or cause more fear in us because of our asking. That's good news, right? that the God of the universe, who is not afraid of anything and has never been afraid of anything and won't be afraid of anything, when frail humans come to him and say, "Help, I'm afraid, give me wisdom on what to do with my fear," he doesn't say, "Foolish humans," and flick us off into the distance or turn his back and walk away. James tells us he's not going to rebuke us for asking for wisdom about things that we need help with, even something like fear. Now, there's a person in the biblical text, in the Jewish Testament of the Bible, what we sometimes call the Old Testament, known as David. And David is the guy that is the shepherd boy turned king of Israel. And he's sort of the classic rags to riches thing. Matter of fact, we believe that many of the rags to riches stories that you might hear now have something in relationship to this story of David. And he's a great man of God, described as a person being after God's very own heart. And yet, David writes very often psalms about being afraid. He writes a lot about things that he's afraid of and what he has had to learn to do and what his approach is when he encounters something that makes him afraid. In one place in particular, he writes the following in Psalm 56, verse 1 to 4. Read the heading part of this that David wrote. David wrote that this psalm is for the choir director, that it's one of his psalms regarding the time when the Philistines seized him, took him captive in Gath, which was a major part of their territory. And then he references a tune that they should sing this song to. No idea what that is, but Dove on Distant Oaks doesn't sound like it would help me not be afraid. But I've not heard the song. Anyway, here's what David actually says then about this situation. He says, "Oh God, have mercy on me, for people are hounding me. My foes attack me all day long. I am constantly hounded by those who slander me, and many are boldly attacking me." Here's the fact. David was afraid, and the truth of the matter is, he's describing something that any rational person would actually be afraid of. If someone's hunting you, deliberately trying to harm you and or take your life, intelligent people are a little concerned about that. Right? It's totally legitimate concerns that David carries related to what's happening to him. And what he's saying is, these things make me afraid. He's naming it. He's acknowledging it. He's putting it out there specifically. This scares me. But he doesn't just stay at that level with it, because he goes on to write in verses 3 and 4 the following words. "But when I am afraid," saying, I am afraid. This does happen to me. When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. That "I will put my trust in you" is like this ongoing action type of phrasing. Meaning that David's not saying, well, if I put my trust in God one time, I'll never be afraid again. David is saying that when I encounter the things that I'm afraid of, I have to continually do the exercise of putting my trust in God. I have to do that over and over and over and over again as many times as necessary. And then he talks a little bit about what that looks like. And David says, so he praises God for what God has promised. And he trusts in God, and he reminds himself that by trusting in God, what does he really have to be afraid of? And then he says, truth be told, mere mortals can't really do anything to the real me. Now, he's not saying they can't kill him. He's saying that there's something about who he is that they can't actually touch. And he's acknowledging the fact that whatever comes into his life, even things that make him afraid, do not enter his life without first passing through the permission of God. So that God is intimately involved even in the things that he is terrified about. David says, when facing legitimate fears, praising God for what he has promised helps. And he says, recognizing that ultimately God is in charge of our lives, and nothing comes into our lives that don't first pass through his permission, brings encouragement and help when he's afraid. Now, there's one more guy I want to talk to you about. There's a guy that's a Jewish prophet named Jeremiah. And Jeremiah lived and ministered as a prophet of God and wrote the things that he wrote as a prophet of God during the worst of times for the Jewish nation. During a time when they had gone too far and the judgment of God was raining down all around them and on them because they had gone too far for that to be acceptable to God. And God speaks to Jeremiah and tells Jeremiah, give this message to my people. In the situation they're in the context that they're in, with the stuff that's going on all around them, none of which is good, give them this message. And here's the message. In those days, in those dark days when things look like nothing but doom and gloom, in those days when you pray, I, God, will listen. And if you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. These are the words of God to the Jewish people. And interestingly enough, we find over and over and over again in the Christian Testament, in what we often call the New Testament of the Bible, that God says the same thing to us as believers over and over again. That when you pray, whatever it's about, even if it's about what you're afraid of, I will listen. I'm going to hear your prayers. I'm going to listen to your prayers. And the wisdom that if you look for God wholeheartedly, you will find him. He wants to be found by those who are wholeheartedly looking for him. I want to remind us of one more verse. And it's another one that often gets misused, but speaks powerfully into this situation. Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good, for those who love God and are called according to his purpose for him. The reminder for us in this text, what we should really learn and what we should really hang on to and what should really help us in this text, is the reminder for us that God is at work. That God is at work in our lives. And that not everything that comes into our life might fit in the box of what is good, but God is always at work to bring good from things in our life and into our life. And so while things may not always turn out the way that we want, and on occasions our worst fears may actually come true, God is still at work for our ultimate good as he defines what good is and what good is in our lives. So what do we need for help? Just three things that I want to remind you of that we learn from these texts today. One is that you're never going to overcome fear unless you ask God. It's just not going to transpire. And as it relates to certain specific things, we're never going to get beyond that without divine help. And so asking God for help with it is, well, it's probably the best place to start, right? To just be honest to God and say something like, God, I'm sure you're already aware how afraid I am. So if you don't want me to be afraid, help me to not be afraid. Help me to overcome whatever it is that's driving this fear in my life. I also want to suggest to you that part of this looks like acknowledging our fears and putting our faith in God. You realize that God can do anything He wants, but He doesn't generally force things on us. Not even generally really good things. And so very often the reason why we don't receive in our lives what it is that we would like to receive is because we don't ask. And don't run out of here saying, oh, Todd's into the prosperity gospel. He just said, anything I want, I can ask for it and God will give it to me. No. Todd did not say that. But what I am saying is that sometimes this starts with acknowledging the fact that we're afraid. Because some of us have been told and we've been convinced that fear isn't something that should be true of a Christian. And so we're like embarrassed about it and we don't want to admit it and we don't want to acknowledge it, not even to God. And so sometimes it starts with just being honest enough with ourselves and honest enough with God and others to acknowledge our fear and then also take that step of putting our trust in God, our faith in God. Right? To say, I'm afraid, so help me trust in you. Kind of like the person that told Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief. All right? And then just a final thing. Remember that God is at work for our good. That doesn't mean that the things that we're afraid of won't ever happen. And it doesn't mean that nothing bad is going to come into our life. But what it does mean is that God is always working for our good, even in the middle of that stuff. And we just need to lean into Him and seek Him. Craig Groeschel writes this, and I want to leave you with this thought. Hear these words. God has not given you, us, a spirit of fear. If you or if we are feeling afraid, that's not from Him. So don't accept it. Don't give in to it. What God has given us, what God has given you, is a spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. So seek Him and fear not, for the Lord is with you and the Lord is with us. Let's be people who remind ourselves often that we need to be people who do the hard work of preventing fear from ruling our lives and who enter into that realm of actively working to detoxify ourselves from the devastating effect of fear. Join me in a prayer. Oh Lord, you know just how much we are afraid sometimes. How much we as your children who believe that you're all powerful and all knowing and all loving and who believe that you care about us, how sometimes we are still afraid. Lord, help us to grapple with the reality that fear is not something that comes from you. It's something that comes from your enemy. And that while there are fears who can help us, like there are things that we should be afraid of and avoid, so many of them are things that live in the realm and feed on the soil of what-ifs. So Lord, I would ask for myself today that you would remind me when I'm afraid where that comes from and what it is that you genuinely offer to me. And maybe my brothers and sisters would want to join me in that today. So, Lord, we together acknowledge our fears before you today. And today we ask that you would give us wisdom about them, that you would guide us toward your truth, and that we could say like David, but when I am afraid, I make the choice to put my trust in you. Help us through the power and the love of Jesus Christ to do this. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. At this time, if you're able, would you please stand and join the worship team? They're going to lead us in a